US automakers are in trouble. What with the global tariffs, lots of competition, and supply chain issues, I think it's kind of an open secret that while they're not necessarily on life support, they are certainly not out of the hospital. Now, we're going to talk about all of those issues, but first we're going to start with the huge issues that are impacting not just US automakers, but automakers around the world, and that is post-pandemic profit drops and foreign competition. Automakers thrived in the pandemic. Many are now struggling. Changing technology, political turmoil, and competition from China are cutting into profits and forcing car makers to cut jobs and close factories. A few years ago, automakers were celebrating record profits as the pandemic created a shortage of new cars, allowing them to raise prices. Now the hangovers are setting in. Nissan, the Japanese automaker, is laying off 9,000 employees. Volkswagen is considering closing factories in Germany for the first time. The chief executive for the US and European automaker Stellantis, which owns Jeep, Peugeot, Fiat, and other brands, quit after sales tumbled. Even luxury brands like BMW and Mercedes-Benz are struggling. So it's not just the US automakers that are struggling. Basically, all automakers worldwide, aside from a few in China, are really having a rough time right now. Now, there are some challenges that are unique to the US automakers, and we'll discuss those in a minute. Each car maker has its own problems, but there are common threads. They include a tricky and expensive technological transition, political turmoil, rising protectionism, and the emergence of a new class of fast-growing Chinese car makers. The many woes raise questions about the future of companies that are a critical source of jobs in many Western and Asian countries. And whatever your leanings are, political or otherwise, a sudden loss of car manufacturing in the United States would be absolutely terrible. Sure, consumers might potentially get cheaper cars if we started importing them from China without any tariffs, but also you would lose about 1 million US car-based manufacturing jobs. And you can imagine that would be pretty devastating. The federal government, for example, has laid off like a little over 100,000 people at this point, and the ripple effects of that are very sizable. Imagine how much worse it would be if you laid off 10 times as many people in something like a manufacturing sector like cars. Many of these problems have been apparent for years, but became less pressing during the pandemic, lulling some automakers into complacency. When shortages of semiconductors and other components slowed production amid limited inventory, car makers found it easy to raise prices. But that era is over, and the industry has reverted to its pre-pandemic state, with too many car makers chasing too few buyers. And that was an absolutely huge mistake on the car manufacturer's part. And this is also a big issue we have with the stock price incentive, where your stock price has to go up a little bit every quarter in order for you to get your bonuses and stay in power. There's basically no motivation to spend on research and development in the short term because research and development is really expensive. So if you don't spend on that, then you've made more money and you get more in your paycheck. Whereas long term, obviously you can see why that would be an issue because other companies, probably companies in China right now, will spend more money on research and development. And then when they get ahead, then your company starts to fail, all because you were looking quarter to quarter trying to increase profits rather than having a long-term plan of researching and developing better cars or more efficient cars or better ways to build more efficient cars. Car manufacturers knew that this would be an issue. They had record profits to deal with it, and they simply chose not to. They chose to pocket those costs and then fire people down the road rather than investing that money back into their manufacturing to try and make it better so that they could compete in the future. And now they're going to pay the price of that decision, but more specifically, the employees that had no say in any of this will pay the price for that decision because they're the ones getting laid off. If the CEO gets laid off, whatever, he still made millions and millions of dollars. He's going to be just fine. But, mom and pop that worked the honest manufacturing job just to make ends meet, they're going to be the ones that really suffer here. Car manufacturers are now chasing too few customers that don't specifically want US cars because they're more expensive and also not as good as the foreign counterparts, i.e. the Chinese cars like BYD. And a result of that is us getting layoffs. You can see here, Ford cuts 4,000 jobs in Europe amid weak demands for EVs and rising competition. Move on to here. Stellantis, which remember owns Jeep and Fiat and some other companies, announces more than 11,000 layoffs in Toledo. GM lays off 1,000 employees amid reorganization and cost cutting because their stock price is also going down. We can see this ripple effect of record profits and then choosing not to do anything useful with those record profits aside from pocketing them and taking extra bonuses and patting themselves on the back. And now we see the ripple effect of this. Now, before we move on and talk more about the auto industry, if you like this kind of video, I try to post 2 or 3 times a week and I'd love a subscription. Now, I know some of you will try and argue that the companies actually did try to innovate. Specifically, they tried to innovate with EVs, and kind of the bet that they took on EVs did not pan out. It went badly for the companies and they lost a lot of money. And you're right. But you're only right partially. I want to read an excerpt from Business Insider here to highlight what I mean. A massive and expensive pivot to EVs has failed to turn a profit, which is probably what a lot of people are arguing. The auto industry has invested or announced plans to invest more than $300 billion in U.S. EV and battery production since 2016, the NRDC estimates. That's led to a slew of new models on the market and relatively cheaper prices for customers. But despite that growth, with EVs accounting for roughly 10% of U.S. auto sales, companies not named Tesla have struggled to make their EV businesses profitable, and Tesla specifically in the last couple of weeks has not been doing so great. GM, for example, had invested $35 billion into its EV and autonomous driving business, which has led to new electric models like the Hummer EV and Cadillac Lyriq. Despite the warm reception from the public, the company's profits this year are entirely driven by strong sales of its internal combustion engine trucks and SUVs. GM said that it expects its EVs to reach profitability sometime before the end of the year. It's the same story with Ford. The company's Model E EV division lost nearly $3.7 billion during the first 9 months of this year, including $1.2 billion in the last quarter alone. So yes, they tried, and yes, they failed. But they didn't fail because people don't want it. They failed because they really did not think this plan through at all. I want to show you something. Here, according to Wikipedia, are global EV sales. And as you can see, from 2011 to basically the present date, they have been growing exponentially. The demand is clearly there. Norway, for example, has an almost 90% EV adoption rate. So why in America specifically, with American manufacturing, is this failing when we're seeing the adoption rate of EVs in other countries pretty high and continuing to grow? And I think there are two big reasons for that. The first is price, and the second is convenience. For the first, price, US EVs are basically just too expensive, and wages aren't growing fast enough to justify paying that much more money for an EV when you could get a much cheaper and comparable combustion engine car that runs on gas. And that same price means that they can't be globally competitive against Chinese EVs, which are much cheaper and also arguably in a lot of ways a lot better cars. And the second thing is convenience. We simply do not have the knowledge and the infrastructure for large-scale EV adoption, at least in the United States. Any car with gas can go to most any gas station and just fill up there, but only certain EVs can go to certain EV chargers. There's been a bit of a push recently to make EV charging more universal, but very notably, Teslas and Fords and some Hondas have different charging ports, meaning if you go to an EV charging station, unless you have a car model that is compatible with that charging station, then you might not actually even be able to charge your car at all. It is so stupid, but there is no national standard for EV charging, which means that any company that makes an EV car can make their own kind of plug, and as a result of that, you can't charge anywhere else. There's also not enough charging stations overall, and also the charging stations that do exist do not charge fast enough. Also, a lot of homes do not have charging stations, and you get the idea. We don't have enough charging, the charging is not fast enough, and the charging is not prominent in places where people are or where their cars are, namely in their home, in their garage. Also, mechanics in the United States are not trained to work on EVs nearly as much as they are trained to work on combustion engine cars. That means if you need maintenance, then you have to go to the dealership. And anyone who has ever been to a dealership for maintenance knows that it's far more expensive and also often not really that good. And this drives consumers away because it is less convenient and more expensive to have a car that is arguably, in a lot of ways, much worse. So if you're a car company and you can't compete internationally on price or features, and you can't compete domestically on convenience and just general ease of ownership and cost of ownership, then of course you're going to fail. And we are currently seeing the result of that failure to the tune of several billion dollars going down the drain and contributing to these auto industry layoffs. So far for issues, we've had post-pandemic profit drops and foreign competition heating up. And now I want to talk about a more American-specific issue, and specifically, and please do not click off the video here, I want to talk about tariffs. Cars.com did a good article here, and I want to talk about what they say. What should I know about tariffs changing car prices? New cars and trucks would get more expensive. If the new car you're interested in is built in Canada or Mexico, roughly 1 in 5 cars sold in the United States are, it would have a 25% tax slapped on it that the automaker is going to have to pay when they bring it across the border. That cost is almost certainly not going to be eaten by the automaker, which would take a massive hit off its profitability. And it's not paid by the country in which it is built. That's simply not how tariffs work. Instead, it would be passed on to the consumer. That is you and me, the ones purchasing the car. And it's not just the cars that are assembled overseas. It's that if any pieces of any cars, so the chassis or the wheel wells or some of the computer components, if those are assembled somewhere else and then shipped over here, even if they're assembled in the United States, those individual pieces that are brought over the border would also be subject to those tariffs. The metal could come from one place, the chips could come from another place, the rubber could come from a third place, price, and all of those could be tariffed, driving up the price of the car, even if it is technically built here in the United States. And if people are turned away from new cars because the price of them is going up rapidly due to tariffs, then all of those people are going to go to the used car market. And when the demand at the used car market skyrockets, so will the price. So the tariff will impact both new and used cars, because all the people who don't want new cars now because they're too expensive will buy used cars, and the used car price will go up. This is basically what we saw during the pandemic, where used car prices jumped like 50 to 100% in some areas. So tariffs will definitely cause price increases for cars. And we know Trump knows this because he gave car manufacturers an extra month to try and figure out what they were going to do about the impending tariffs. Now, a month is probably not long enough. If you're trying to move your manufacturing from Canada or from Mexico to the United States, you need many, many months, maybe even years. But it might give them enough time to draft together a plan of action where they plan to, over the next 5 years, shift all of their manufacturing back over the border to the United States, and there's a possibility that Trump would then give them an extension on their tariff exemption until that factory is built. In addition to tariffs, we do also have some smaller things. There's like union workers going on strikes, the UAW lawsuits against automakers, regulatory changes imposing stricter laws around emissions, which just makes the cars more expensive both to build and also to test, efficiency, and just the general supply chain issues that we continue to see, and so on. Now, these are much smaller things, and normally they're just kind of part of doing business. But recently, with all the other issues that car makers are running into, these are kind of becoming the straws that are breaking the camel's back. Now, with all this, of course, we reach the question, well, what can we do about it? And the answer is probably not a lot. Car companies are doing a really good job of trying to figure it out now, right now, but by and large, it is far too little, far too late. They had 3 to 5 really profitable years during the pandemic to set themselves up for global success in years and years to come by more factories, better cars, better manufacturing practices, some way to make them cheaper and more competitive on a domestic and global market. And they failed to do any of that, opting instead to just take the profit and keep the bonuses for themselves. And now they are suffering the consequences of that. It's like asking how you fix things after you've already got diabetes. Like, sure, there are some things you can do now to mitigate the damage, but by and large, the best thing to do would have been whatever it took to not reach this place in the first place. To resolve this, you must now build better cars that are cheaper and as such can compete globally. But there's a chance that the opportunity to catch up has basically passed because all the CEOs cared about was the next quarterly earnings report and also boosting their personal paychecks. Thanks for watching.